You know your kind ain't welcome here.
Well, maybe not. But I'm gonna make myself welcome.
There'd better be a killer reason for standing in my shadow. Does next on the menu ring a bell for ya, Normie?
I wasn't always like this. I was a goddamn scientist. We were doing great things. Amazing things.
Any chems I could find, the more exotic the better. Finally found this experimental radiation drug. Only one of its kind left, and only one hit. Oh man, the high was so worth it. Yeah, I'm living with the side effects, but hey, what's not to love about immortality?
You must have reconsidered. Ghoulification is the only logical choice.
The ghouls that are found in Fallout are one of a kind. I don't mean that as in they are the only version of themselves in fiction. As a matter of fact, they are probably one of the more vanilla nuclear mutations, if all matter of fiction is to be taken into account. However, I can't help but feel like there is somewhat of an inconsistency when it comes to ghouls. Some of that could be due just to retcons and not following the pre-established lore, but there's another problem in the sense that simply all ghouls aren't the same either, and new aspects are introduced to them pretty much every single release of a title. We would expect other significant biological mutations from radiation, and sometimes we do, but ghouls might be more special on their own than we realize. I mean, yeah, they're immune to radiation, they age really slowly, or even not at all, and sometimes they go feral. But that's pretty much the only thing that's inherent in all ghouls, as there's pretty much always some significant difference between ghouls in every Fallout game. For instance, some of them have hair, some of them don't need to eat, some of them are children, some of them have inherent mutant powers, and some of them can easily survive mortal injuries. And one of them even formed a symbiotic relationship with a radiation-immune tree. So, with all this being said, my goal today, above everything else, is we need to set up some actual consistencies with ghouls and their permanence in the Fallout universe, as well as exploring as many types of ghouls we can find. So, this may not be as much of an investigation as my other theories, but we might just unearth some things that raise some heads. This is the ghoul theory. But first, wow, I'm getting good at these variety content theories. Anyways, this is just a reminder that although theories are really fun for me to make, they also take a significantly longer amount of effort, and often more than all of my other content to create, as a great deal of the effort goes into the brainwork of trying to figure out how all the pieces of a lore universe fit together. Thus, if you do enjoy the theory content here and you want to see more like it, please consider supporting me in whatever way you see fit, whether that be through becoming a channel or a Patreon member, subscribing with notifications, giving this video your hype, or even just leaving a comment down below telling me what you enjoyed as well as what you'd like to see next. But with all that being said, I will now begin the theory. So, if you've only played one Fallout game and didn't really interact with them much, or maybe you just watched the Fallout show, or maybe not even that and are just curious what the ghouls are in the Fallout universe, well, look no further. Ghouls are the result of human beings who have suffered significant radiation exposure, resulting in their body undergoing a sort of mutation. This mutation causes their body to develop this rotten, burnt, dry, corpse-like looking appearance, often losing anywhere from barely any to all of their hair, almost always losing their nose, maybe losing an eye, and other physical deformities. Aside from being generally perceived by most as hideous, they do have a fair amount of advantages in their new forms too. For one, they don't age anymore in the traditional sense, with numerous ghouls having been around since even before the bombs dropped, and are still capable of the physicality they had ever since becoming a ghoul, and are also mostly but not entirely immune to the harmful effects of radiation, with it sometimes even causing a healing effect for themselves. The reason why I say not entirely is because of the main reason someone wouldn't want to become a ghoul, and that is the possibility of becoming feral. Becoming a ghoul, in addition to mutating one's appearance, also has the consistent possibility of losing their sense of self and higher brain functions entirely, and becoming a mindless zombie that only knows how to attack and consume other non-ghouls. Additionally, they remain and can remain completely still for hundreds of years in this state without ever even moving, don't appear to show any signs of life other than when it does move, and possibly maybe not even breathe. Thus, there is a good possibility that when a ghoul goes feral, that in addition to the person inside being lost, that they are additionally just probably dead, and essentially just a reanimated corpse using the brain as a sort of driver. The process of the transformation from ghoul to feral ghoul, or even human to ghoul, is not really fully defined. However, among the possibilities, the most likely one, or at least in my opinion, is that of extreme radiation. Ghouls may be immune to the harmful effects of radiation initially, but just like drinking alcohol, smoking, or eating junk food every day for 20 years, eventually you're going to have issues, and I see ghouls as no different. But despite this, the potentiality of going feral leads a fair amount of people to not trust ghouls, though others just have a sort of supremacy viewpoint against them. Nevertheless, ghouls, despite being infertile and their exact transformation being a bit of an uncertainty, are probably the second most common race in the Fallout universe alongside humans, and one of the most compatible with them. But now we have to ask ourselves that, among the other creatures that mutate in Fallout, such as giant scorpions, giant roaches, okay, why is every arthropod just giant now? And I approve, yet another display of arthropod supremacy, but things like cows growing second heads, why ghouls? And even more strangely, this ghoul-like mutation appears to be shared by a lot of mammals. Thus we have our first lead, and it leads me to believe that ghoulism is potentially even an inherent mutation already present in the genetic makeup of some mammals. So, we have a pretty common mutation from humans when exposed to significant radiation amounts that cause them to develop this sort of rotten, dried, emaciated look to their skin, but in turn be mostly immune to radiation. This isn't the 100% end-all be-all mutation in regards to all radiation exposure in Fallout, that's possibly another video for another time, but radiation also very consistently causes a ghoul-like mutation in humans, and it appears to be capable of affecting other primates, and potentially other mammals as a whole. We have the only other confirmed ghoul-like animal from human ghouls being the gorilla, but there is a good chance that other mammals are capable of becoming ghoul-like as well. So, what's going on here? Well, my answer to what ghouls are, or rather just in regards to humans and gorillas, and maybe dogs, is epigenetics. What epigenetics is effectively an activation of dormant genes inside of an organism that can trigger when certain environmental factors are created. This is not a rewiring of an organism's genetics or DNA, simply activating what is already there when the need arises, and reading the DNA in a different way. This occurs in various animal and plant species, and is actually somewhat common. As an example, in certain plant species, when the plant structures are under stress, for instance if an insect is trying to eat it, it can sometimes produce a poisonous concoction in its body as a chemical response to defend itself. However, this is easily on the more mild of responses, as quite a few of them can lead to permanent changes. Locusts, as an insect, are fairly well known, being capable of spawning in massive swarms and totally decimating crop yields. However, the locust itself is actually a transformation from a grasshopper, which is caused from environmental factors on it, such as lack of food. This new locust is physically larger, stronger, and can fly great distances in migratory patterns as well. This transformation into the locust is permanent, and other arthropods routinely make this transformation as well, with insects like bees selectively creating new queens in their colonies, and a very similar state in regards to shrimp living in sponges under the ocean. And lastly, yes, epigenetics can affect mammals as well, when it comes to domesticated pigs being released into the wild, and activating dormant genetics that cause them to grow pronounced tusks, and become more boar-like. This itself is actually a topic I've talked about before in a previous series about pigs and Don't Starve, but when we relate this back, what am I trying to say here? Well, it's that I believe that ghouls, despite being rather archaic, and seeing as to how ghouls can't reproduce, are likely a genetic dead end, may actually be an example of human epigenetics. And it goes a bit further than just surviving radiation too. Typically in pretty much every Fallout game, the climate is described as anywhere from warm to damn heat to almost wishing for a nuclear winter. And ghoul's skin typically has this very dry, rough look to it, almost in a similar effect to that of lizards, snakes, and tortoises in desert environments, which would be a fairly beneficial adaptation to the heat as well as the resistance to radiation. Additionally, there are other variations of both temporary and permanent changes in epigenetics in humans based on their environments, such as Tibetans who have lived at high elevations for thousands of years, who are born with reduced lung capacity, able to handle the thinner air in these environments, but additionally other individuals can develop this same lung capacity after prolonged exposure to these environments after some years. So it could be that that ghouls are just a variation of epigenetics in irradiated hot environments. There's even a few recorded cases of humans becoming ghouls before the war, as a means to prolong one's life inside of a bunker, as is the case with Eddie Winter, the mob boss from Nick Valentine's Personal Quest, who commissioned a doctor who had a theory that the right amounts of radiation at the right time targeting the right cells can induce a mutation.
He didn't want to be a frozen banana. No cryo sleep for him, no. He invested his money in some sick, crazy radiation experiment. Eddie Winter went and turned himself into a ghoul, 200 years before it was fashionable. Hell, he was probably the first one. And I'm convinced that he's still locked inside that shelter.
And we can round this part to its conclusion at the saying of something that a lot of us already guessed, in that likely not every person can become a ghoul due to genetics, as just as someone's genes vary from person to person, their epigenetics vary as well, obviously. And although we can't prove this is objectively true yet, we can safely make the assumption that ghoulism is largely based on dormant genes in certain people when exposed to prolonged radiation. And it would explain why some people can become ghouls from just getting irradiated, whereas others drop dead, and others can even become ghouls from certain drugs. Thus, we have to ask the next question when it comes to cataloging and characterizing them: how many species of ghouls are there? So we have ghouls that can emerge from people with certain dormant epigenetics. They are all invariably highly resistant to, and oftentimes even benefit from, radiation. They either age very slowly or not at all, and they always develop a scarring, very dry, emaciated skin that may or may not help with the heat. And they have a fate that may be linked to either radiation or also genetics that cause their brains to rot while causing them to become feral. Though, as has recently been added or retconned, there is a way to stave off becoming feral from a drug. But as stated in the opening, pretty much every other ghoul trait varies. Some of them go feral instantly, some of them can eat pretty much anything without issue, some of them don't need to eat or drink at all, some of them can regenerate wounds either with radiation or inherently, others seem to slowly fall apart over time. So let's get into some classifications and namings. The first general classification of ghouls I'm going to give are the most common types I've seen throughout the Fallout games, that I'm going to give the name of Terrans. Terran Ghouls, as stated, are probably the most common types of ghouls in the Fallout series, currently occurring since Fallout 3 up to now. Like the others, they don't mind radiation for the most part up until they go feral. They may or may not be hostile to feral ghouls, as it does somewhat vary in gameplay, though I lean more on the idea that it just varies from ghoul to ghoul. And there's no upper limit to how long they live either. Terrans may or may not receive some type of healing factor from radiation, but largely it doesn't appear to be as borderline overpowered as we see in more recent variants. Terrans largely don't need to eat, though they still consume food, either for pleasure, or because they still derive some sort of energy from it, which I would assume they otherwise get from the environment due to radiation, or just due to having some internal energy creation system in their bodies. Just like the other ghoul types, they can go feral, whether that be from excess radiation, or maybe it's just their time. These ghouls can often be found living in normal human settlements as regular people or other roles. Their appearance varies, with eye colors ranging from a very tired look, but still largely human-like, to completely black in color. Bald is a common hair type, but just as they are to have hair, with gray being a common color too, but all other colors being fairly common as well. Lastly, their skin color additionally varies from shades of light gray to brown to even more orange or red colors, and despite the physical scarring of their skin and the pretty much universal loss of a ghoul's nose, there's usually no serious mutilation of their bodies, suggesting a fairly decent health upkeep. This isn't always the case though, as Fallout 3 and New Vegas ghouls retain a more rotten appearance instead, looking more so of that than they do dried up. However, with some slight variations in the way they behave or their rules on food consumption, a majority of ghouls in the Fallout series would generally slot into this category. Likely they can consume the fixed drug just fine as well. Up next, we have more of the old-school variant of ghouls from Fallout 1 and 2, and this was largely before feral ghouls were considered too different. This was the main narrative of ghouls for a while, and has some aspects following it into titles like Fallout 3. I'm referring to these ghouls as necrotics or walkers. Necrotic ghouls, from a functionality standpoint, appear to be similar to just zombies that can think for themselves and have autonomy. They do appear to, at least in part, need to eat, and have no qualms with cannibalism either. In the first game, most of them are inherently hostile, but that also has nothing to do with them being ghouls, as there is a population of them in the city of Necropolis that are led by a gang leader by the name of Set, who is very aggressive, and there's even a faction of ghouls directly under the main city, Necropolis, who are peaceful. But seeing as to how the ghouls need to consume water, it probably goes that they also have a hunger requirement too. Anyways, they basically resemble rotting corpses. We can see a bit more of this necrotic looking type in both Fallout 3 and New Vegas, as well as the older titles. It's not unusual for them to be missing body parts like eyes, and having an emaciated appearance either. Overall, these ghouls don't look friendly, and they usually aren't, and have the least appearance differences from themselves and feral members of their kind. And it goes hand in hand that this group is also universally ignored or allied with feral ghouls, able to pass by them with little to no issue, and even use them for defense or sick them on their opponents. And it's even revealed that when it comes to these types of ghouls, the feral ghoul's desire to attack is largely based around smell and scent, so it makes sense that the variant of ghouls that seem as though they invariably smell like rotting meat would also be totally immune to them. Now the third variant of ghouls, though I don't know if I would say it is a retcon, but definitely a greater display of how powerful a ghoul can become, is that of the very regenerative, resistant, drug-meeting, almost vampire-like in its survivability, and potential power induced by ghoulism. Thus, I'm appropriately naming them Vampire Ghouls. Vampire ghouls, in regards to physicality, appear to be better than humans in most categories. As with the others, vampire ghouls are not only totally immune to radiation, but actively consume it to empower themselves. Thus, they can eat and drink virtually anything without much issue, and they don't age either. In appearance-wise, they generally look the same as Terrans, dried and burnt up, though maybe with the caveat of having green eyes or something. As for their regeneration, it is without a doubt far beyond that of a human, or even most other ghouls, with them able to shrug off lethal damage seemingly as long as the brain isn't destroyed, and even more so, they don't even need to initially ingest more radiation to engage in this regeneration. This makes their survivability several times higher than that of a human on base principles. And if Fallout 76 is to be taken into account, vampire ghouls are also capable of greatly utilizing radiation, whether that being to physically empower or protect themselves, or harm others. This makes any vampire ghoul a terrifying opponent to deal with, as a single one could be more than a match for several humans. And finally, for the positives, vampire ghouls appear to be the most common type of replicable process for ghoulification. Although it is more than likely that vampire ghouls also come from simple radiation exposure, the majority of ghouls that behave like this that we know of have undergone a sort of intentional process to become one. The process being almost always a drug of sorts that likely contains intense amounts of radiation. The appearance of ghoulism, once again, does seem to vary, with some only developing scars over time, and others having instant transformations. All in all, though, vampire ghouls are currently the most replicable process for intentionally becoming one, although they are far from the most common type of ghoul. However, vampire ghouls are not without their problems either. In regards to whether or not they need to eat, you have Fallout 76 that replaces hunger and thirst with a feral meter that is kept down by chems, but in the Fallout show, you have this scene.
You know, my mom used to...
Sometimes, fella's gotta eat a fella.
So it appears as though they can substitute their needs for sustenance with radiation or drugs of some degree, with some of them even openly turning to cannibalism without a second thought, and guzzling down other irradiated garbage that would kill a normal person. Thus, I'm going to say that vampire ghouls don't need to eat, especially when they're in a more dormant state, but whenever they're in an active state, it can still give them a boost of energy. Thus, this is far from a deal breaker. However, the next baggage would make most people think twice about becoming one of them. Vampiric ghouls appear to have the biggest creep towards becoming feral compared to any other ghoul, with vampire ghouls facing the constant active threat of going feral at all times, and can only stave off the feral impulse by taking drugs, most notably being these unconfirmed vials and other drugs called the Fix. The specifics of these drugs are unknown, but we can theorize there is possibly some ghoul biological component added to them. Personally, my theory is that since in Fallout 76 the hunger and thirst meter is replaced entirely by the feral meter that can be staved off by taking any drugs, that the drugs are more or less just being used to keep the brain active and thus alive. Additionally, even though vampiric ghouls are just as capable of going feral as others, they seem to be the one ghoul type that is often hostile to feral ghouls, while non-feral. This can be seen not only in gameplay, but multiple ghouls we have confirmed that turned using a drug, being Hancock from Fallout 4 and the player in Fallout 76, potentially Thaddeus, and even potentially Eddie Winter.
Finally found this experimental radiation drug. Only one of its kind left, and only one hit. Oh man, the high was so worth it. Yeah, I'm living with the side effects, but hey, what's not to love about immortality?
Granted, in Fallout 76, the player can even become feral themselves, though during this they are still considered hostile to feral ghouls, thus I think this part of 76 is more of a game element than having any actual standing in lore, as it's already been well established, once you go feral, you're like that forever. This, along with the whole not all ghouls are immune to ferals, are the parts of this new ghoul lore that I don't really like, and see as more of a retcon than anything, as it feels more like it's trying to overpower previously established aspects of ghoulism and how ferals behave around them. That being said, let's move on to the final type of main ghouls that can be found in-game, and these ones are simply those who went feral at the very start. Feral ghouls were ghouls that both became feral, and also people that, due to how their ghoulification happened, likely never had a non-feral stage, like maybe right next to one of the bomb detonation sites. It's uncertain what percentage of ghouls didn't have a feral stage, but it's safe to assume a fair amount of them didn't, seeing as to how many pre-war buildings we can find with ghouls wearing the exact same clothing that they would have been when the bombs dropped. Feral ghouls don't have too much to talk about other than the debate if they are even still alive. It's a well-known fact that a feral ghoul's brain is rotten and irradiated, causing them to go into a madness. However, there is evidence both for and against the idea that they're actually dead. Evidence for them being alive includes that when they are in an active state, they move and behave similar to as though an animal would. They attack and eat things, they are aggressive and territorial, but also know not to attack their own kind, and since we know that with the ghoul mask that their ability to detect friend and foe does partially rely on scent, and lastly, although the brain is rotted, it is also still alive enough to still function as at least a driver for the ghoul, as the Mechanist was able to remove ghoul brains and use them in robo-brains. As for them being dead, as stated earlier, it's completely common for a ghoul to just lie down and not move at all for extreme periods of time, capable of doing nothing or even breathing for potentially hundreds of years. Furthermore, the brain is confirmed to be rotted, meaning in at least some capacity it is partially dead, and since the ghoul's body consistently produces radiation, that radiation could simply be using the rotted dead brain as a driver for a since dead creature just using its basic primal functions. I think you could argue either side, but that being said, ferals can be tricked with simple sense and possibly also irradiating oneself, as is with the ghoulish trait. There is additionally no known way to cure becoming feral, which is why it's often seen as death for a non-feral ghoul. Though since ferals largely are far beyond almost any physical requirement, they also have the largest variety of ghoul types, with ghouls capable of being withered, bloated, charred, gangrenous, reavers, rotted, and most importantly, glowing ones. Glowing ones are the most interesting, as not only are they covered in radiation, far beyond the other ghouls to the point to where they glow, and irradiate anything even standing near it, but they also have the ability to send forth a burst of radiation, healing and even resurrecting dead ghouls, possibly including ghouls that aren't even feral, depending on whether or not Deem was feral, in this terminal from Oswald the Outrageous in the Nuka World DLC for Fallout 4. But that there may even be a slightly higher level of intelligence in glowing ones that are feral. Additionally, although most of them are feral, there are still non-feral glowing ones, as is with Fallout 1 and Nuka World's Oswald, but we might get back to them later, as it presents a bit of a conundrum with how glowing ones work. We also have feral ghouls like fog ghouls, or ghouls that hate this weird paste to them, but I don't really think these ones need to be catalogued, as it's more likely that their bodies are just making mild changes to their environment. Now, moving on to the less common types of ghouls, we have several that we can talk about, such as the ghoulrillas and other animals. Ghoulrillas, much like synthetic gorillas, appear to behave exactly like their synth counterparts, being higher level though, and thus more powerful. This is worth talking about, but honestly, I see the whole ghoul animals thing as a bit more easily explainable than it might look like at first. It simply appears that, epigenetics or not, that a fair amount of warm-blooded mammal animals have a similar reaction to radiation. And it isn't exclusive to gorillas either, as dogs also appear to have their normal and ghoulified versions, with mongrels serving as the ghoul variants. But being animals that don't really care that much about physical attractiveness and already aren't as sentient, likely don't see an astronomical change in their behavior even if they stop aging and can't procreate anymore. This obviously isn't the case with all warm-blooded animals like creatures like stags and cows developing a second head, but so far I think this is a pretty safe bet to make that some other animals just can have ghoulism, but largely since they're animals, they overall just ignore it. The Scorched, being part of the greater antagonists of Fallout 76, are actually not ghouls at all, and are instead a form of hive mind disease infected by scorch beasts. They are capable of total cohesion with melee, ranged, and unarmed variants, all fighting alongside each other, and do carry a level of sentience with them. However, despite looking practically identical to the ghouls' skin type, they are actually not related to them at all, and that the ghouls themselves are even immune to the Scorched disease. I only really mention this one because, unlike with creatures like with trogs or swamp folk, these ones look very similar to ghouls, so there you go. Moving on. Marked Men are a rather interesting variant, as instead of being some special subsect of ghouls, they are rather just ghouls who don't have skin anymore because it was blown off in a secondary post-nuclear weather event. They don't appear to have any other special features, but since they lost their skin, they are in a constant state of healing and regeneration because of the radiation amplifying it, but since they have no skin, they're also constantly in pain and damage. It brings into question how far a ghoul's regeneration could go, but as for what kinds of ghouls I think these are, I would probably say they are Terrans, but have the appearance of necrotics because they have no fucking skin. And that's all the variants of the ghouls to my knowledge, that fundamentally could fit the definitions of ghouls. However, there is one final variant that I want to bring attention to, and that is Born Ghouls that come from the cancelled Fallout 3 game, Van Buren, before Bethesda took over the title. Born ghouls are basically as the name implies. Universally, the only known way a ghoul, or at least a ghoul human, can be created is if the person undergoes ghoulism from radiation or drugs or something else and is never born as one. And there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that children don't age as ghouls either. However, Fallout Van Buren had a story section with a reservation, including a ghoul supremacist who had a life goal of creating a reliable way of ghoul reproduction, often resulting in the mutilation and death of humans via experimentation to do so, even more so with the process having only a 2% success rate. The result was the Born Ghouls, a sort of blue-looking version of ghouls that have seemingly symmetrical deformities, like exposed bone or hair splotches, that all appear to serve an actual purpose, and generally being a step up in appearance from regular ghouls, as well as being physically greater as well, being both intelligent, physically healthy, and gifted in melee combat. There was even a Born Ghoul among them by the name of Belle, who was said to be traditionally attractive even by human standards, and that the player could even romance and procreate with her. The title was never released or finished, including finishing the story to find out that the player has a child with Belle, thus nothing in this section is canonical or confirmed to be plausible yet. However, if something like this has been tried somewhere in the wasteland, this would mean that theoretically ghouls could become self-reproducing, and even more so that ghouls have a fair bit to go in regards to biological potential. Similarly to supermutants or even baseline humans, but there may very well be a group of scientists out in the wasteland trying to do that exact thing to improve the ghouls to surpass what they are now. Well, with that being said, that's all both the major and minor types of ghouls that I can think of, including ones that are just speculation. So, where do we go from here? Well, I think we have only one big question left to ask ourselves, as we already did come up with a plausible enough answers for what causes ghoulification, why it does, why they go feral, and why different ghouls behave in different ways. And thus we are left having solved pretty much every question about the general biology and morphology of the ghouls. Thus, the only other question we can think to ask is, can ghouls be cured or revert their forms in any way? In the Fallout universe, ghoulism is treated more or less as an end-all be-all state that there's no coming back from once it's induced, from a lore perspective at least, as in Fallout 76, the player can easily swap back to human using out-of-lore mechanics that the game even makes a joke about now mentioning in the lore.
You think I can just graft your skin back onto you, suck out all the radiation like it never happened? Something like that would only be possible if we had a time machine. Or if this were some kind of simulation where you could select, oops, I changed my mind on that permanent life decision, please take it back. But alas, as far as my own limited awareness extends, we have only this fleeting, chronologically rigid reality.
But this does present a pretty important question about ghouls. Although I don't really see ghoulism as a disease or an affliction, a question I have is that can they actually become human again, or maybe something new? And although there is currently no known cure in Fallout for ghoulism or coming back from becoming feral, and the game quite literally just said straight to my face right now that no there isn't, I want to reference two separate events that could maybe give a more solid answer of future potentiality. The first is back to the discussion with Oswald the Outrageous and his girlfriend's journey out of the theme park that they had held themselves up in. Her journey was to find, hopefully, a cure for becoming feral, or maybe a cure for ghoulism as a whole. We don't know what in specific it was, but we do know is that whatever of the two she was looking for, she ultimately failed, and she had traveled for years before making it back to Nuka World, where she ended herself as she had not wanted to become feral. Therefore, it would be appropriate to assume that the entirety of Fallout, there is at the very least no easily replicable known cure, and that ghouls from a transformation standpoint may very likely carry the same permanence that supermutants have, in the sense that once you are a ghoul, you are one for life. However, there is a way to change back from a supermutant. In Fallout 4, one of the pivotal characters towards making your first entry into the Institute comes from a supermutant hiding out in the glowing sea by the name of Virgil. Virgil, as you might have guessed, is not a normal supermutant. Rather, he was actually instead an Institute scientist who willingly infected himself with a version of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV for short, with which the Institute was experimenting on. This was in order for him to make his escape from the Institute and hide out in the glowing sea, being in a radiated hell where most humans couldn't possibly follow. The reason why Virgil helps you get into the Institute is because he was working on a serum to cure supermutants, and now wishes to use it on himself after escaping. You can help retrieve this serum for him, into which he will inject himself, and after only a few days, if you return again, he appears fully cured of his affliction. Now, the FEV is completely different from ghouls in the sense that one is an artificial virus that fully alters the genetics of those exposed to it, bringing them out to various potentials, sometimes extremely smart, other times having the cognitive processes of a toddler, and although the resulting supermutant is completely immune to radiation, radiation is not even a factor in the initial transformation process, and is also a potential hindrance to someone becoming a mutant in their entirety, causing a total failure to the mutation process. And on the other hand, ghouls appear to be a common mutation, caused largely by the interaction with excessive radiation that fully evolves the organism to be adapted to an irradiated environment. So, why am I mentioning this here? And that is because of Virgil's cosmetic appearance as a human compared to him as a supermutant. Virgil, freshly turned back into a human, looks as though he's never changed into a supermutant at all. He has a full head of hair now, eyebrows, a clean face, no scarring or stretching on his skin that can be seen, despite as a mutant he was completely bald, hairless, massive, and overall having physically deformed skin. He looked completely fine now. It's not like this is just poor design either, seeing as how Bethesda could have easily made him bald and without a beard, as both are options in customizing characters. So it begs the hypothetical question this ghoul doctor asks you when you ask if ghoulism is permanent, as if someone could just stitch the skin back on.
You think I can just graft your skin back onto you? Suck out all the radiation like it never happened?
I am now.
Maybe, just maybe you could. If someone like Virgil could undergo such a drastic transformation, and then change back, albeit with some extremely high-tech background, arguably the most in the entire Fallout series, would there not also be a possible cure for becoming human again from a ghoul, or at least a half-human mix between the two? And the answer to this is something I couldn't possibly give a certain take on, but what I can do is connect everything we know about ghouls, how they work, and the technology present in the Fallout universe. Starting off, we know ghouls, or at least some variants of ghouls, have a rather intense regeneration, capable of mending otherwise mortal wounds, and this regeneration is at least in part fueled by radiation. Radiation that the ghoul, although benefiting from, doesn't necessarily need in order to live. Additionally, we can surmise that most ghouls still have fully functioning organs, just having also adapted to their new radiation-immune body, with implications that since humans and ghouls are still both the same species, the ghoul organs are even compatible with human bodies. If both of these are true, that a ghoul doesn't necessarily need radiation in order to function, and that a ghoul's internal biology organ-wise is roughly the same as humans, that only leaves the rough, blurred skin, and where the main mutation of a ghoul has actually taken place in all the membranes of the human body. So the question becomes, is there a way in Fallout to physically remove the effects of radiation to an afflicted area? And the response to this is not looking good. The first and most common solution to radiation is Radaway, a drug introduced via IV injection that flushes radiation out of the user's system induced by urination. However, it's pretty obvious in-game and even directly states that Radaway doesn't heal any damage physically caused by radiation, rather it's just removing radiation from doing any more damage. In other words, this isn't going to help us at all. As a matter of fact, that appears to be the same solution doctors in Fallout 4 have for radiation as well, by using diuretics to flush out their system. So, dead end? Maybe, but I have one final play, and that among all things actually comes from some of the flora of the Fallout universe. In Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, you can use glowing fungus as one of the key components in creating Radaway, and if we use deductive reasoning on the other components of Radaway, we can assume that the glowing fungus is the main driving force for actually absorbing the radiation. And glowing fungus, although possibly the only fungus, is not the only natural radiation absorber, as we learn from Solomon in Fallout 4 that mutated fern is also a natural radiation absorber.
Yeah, I got something. Looking for a mutated fern if you find any. I hear some grows out near Forest Grove Marsh. Natural radiation sucker. Be great for cooking Rad-X or Radaway.
Okay, so irradiated and/or mutant plants capable of neutralizing or outright absorbing radiation, and in regards to fungi, this is actually something fungi can sometimes do in the real world, using mushrooms to break down harmful chemicals into harmless biological components, referred to as mycoremediation. So, where am I going with this? Well, it goes further than me just thinking some form of flora is the key to curing ghouls' afflictions, which I do think is on the right track, as there's actually a character who might be responsible for a plant's ability to actively absorb radiation. And it's a character who, although we're uncertain, looks and behaves a lot like a ghoul, and has been around even since the very first Fallout game. Let's talk about Harold. So, when I was naming all known variants of ghouls, even ones that weren't really true ghouls, and even those that weren't even confirmed to be canon yet, I intentionally left out Harold. And that's for two reasons. First, in regards to variants, Harold is a brute of one. There is no other ghoul like him in all of the Fallout universe. His transformation was unlike that of any other ghoul, and if the way he transformed is to be taken into account, seemed as though it would be more akin to a super mutant than a ghoul. Essentially, Harold was on an expedition with a few others, one of which being a doctor by the name of Richard Gray. They had made their way to an abandoned military base to try and figure out and prevent the influx of mutated creatures that had been attacking travelers and traders. However, the expedition went horribly wrong, with only Harold making it out of the facility, and at first glance being the sole survivor of the expedition.
We mounted an expedition. God, Richard Gray led a small group of us up there. Some sort of old military base. We lost a lot of folks getting in there. We made it to some sort of central core, like a plant of some sort. That's when it happened. A robot crane crashed into us. Last I saw Gray, he was flying through the air and into some sort of acid bath. I was in bad shape and, well, I passed out. Well, I have no idea. Woke up in the wasteland, barely hanging on. Got lucky and some traders I knew found me days later. Good thing, since I was already changing. They brought me here and here I've been since.
The military base was one of the experimental labs, utilizing the FEV virus to transform people into mutants. Exposure to the FEV inside those vats would have transformed Harold into a super mutant. However, he simply passed out and woke up outside, looking now as what he is. Now, there's a huge debate on whether or not Harold is a mutant or a ghoul, especially considering he refers to himself as a mutant, even though he looks more ghoul-like, as he seemingly has the whole physiology of a ghoul, but still had the exposure to FEV even though he didn't immediately transform into a super mutant. This being the second reason why I didn't initially mention him, because it was never confirmed what exactly Harold is. However, I think I have enough evidence to make a claim that Harold is actually a ghoul, or at least more so of a ghoul than a mutant. And my key piece of evidence comes from Richard Grey and his transformation into the Master. Now, the Master is the main antagonist of Fallout 1. He's the hypothetical god of, and the one leading the operation of the mass creation of super mutants in the first Fallout game. And if I ever do a theory-like video for Super Mutants 2, we'll talk about him a bit more. But as it pertains to ghouls, if you remember Harold's story, Richard Grey got knocked into a vat of FEV virus.
Richard Grey led a small group of us up there. Richard Grey was a doctor. A little older than me, and Fran was he smart. Last I saw Grey, he was flying through the air and into some sort of acid bath.
Seemingly, he would have transformed into a super mutant, but Richard sat inside the FEV vat for an entire month, and when he emerged, he was not like a super mutant either. Interpreting some of his logs, which can be found on one of the computers in that same military base, his skin, although festering green mucus in some locations, was not fully green either, though he may have initially turned mutant-like in size before he became whatever he is now.
The green slime that I was immersed in is the source of all the mutations we traced to here. My skin is starting to fester and peel. In other areas it is bubbling and is expelling a green mucus-like substance. Some days the pain is almost tolerable. I can actually walk a few steps again. It seems inconceivable that I dragged myself all the way up here from the vat room. Strangely, I'm actually feeling stronger, though I'm still in a lot of pain. Everything seems to be getting smaller. I think I consumed one of the mutated things scurrying around here today. Before I knew what was happening, some sort of tendril had sprang from my stomach and covered the poor creature. As soon as it had sucked the rodent into my gut, I could actually feel its mind, I think.
But given the whole tendril thing, and the fact that if we were to reference the Master's skin tone still not being a shade of green, we can assume the Master was never a super mutant. Rather, I initially assumed there was some other component inside that military base that had caused both the Master and Harold's mutations, and I couldn't find anything. There's seemingly no other chemical components inside that facility that would mutate them into what they are other than FEV. But then I remembered that in order for FEV to properly mutate a being into a super mutant, they need to have a low overall exposure to radiation. Something both Harold and Richard Grey could have had, since they were both vault dwellers, though it's safe to assume that they were both out of their vaults for years before they went on to that military base expedition. We also learn a bit more about the reason why radiation exposure needs to be low in order to receive a favorable mutation from FEV, from the Master's lieutenant who's dipping people into the vats.
The FEV was mutated by the war radiation. Those living in this desolate wasteland have been exposed to this mutant FEV, essentially inoculating them from the full effects. So you're from a vault and have limited exposure to this mutated virus. The original FEV in the vats should work quite well on you.
Which could possibly explain the Master's mutation into this chaotic amalgamation of flesh. Harold, on the other hand, wasn't knocked into one of the vats despite breathing in this FEV, which was still ever present inside the military base. Though, with severe wounding from robots and irradiated mutant creatures, Harold eventually passed out for unknown reasons before waking up outside the base. Thus, I believe Harold's exposure was to turn him into an FEV mutant, though the combined factors that the FEV dose he got was lower than average, albeit stronger in the base than outside, and that Harold was likely also irradiated, that his radiation exposure from years out in the wasteland may have actually protected him from becoming an FEV mutant, and instead accelerated his transformation into a sort of hybrid ghoul. However, why I'm harping on it so much is because the Master is psychic.
O glorious Creator, I have succeeded in spreading the complete joy of unification to another soul. I have never known such glory as I felt when taking his mind into our own. We are beginning to create an army dedicated to unifying the wonderful diversity of life. We have trained them to continue our work here while we search out more populated areas to take into ourselves. We are beginning to feel the limitations of a body that is mobile.
The Master can physically feel and interact with the minds of those he touches. Whether he consumes them or simply infects them with FEV, he can then psychically interact with things and influence them to do his bidding, whether by force or by persuasion. Even more so, the Master even created psychic humans that were locked up due to their psychic abilities, causing them to go partially insane. Thus we have FEV as the source of psychic presence. So, what does all of this have to do with Harold? And that's because Harold is psychic as well, or at least has a variation of it. Harold's story did not end in Fallout 1, or even Fallout 2, as in the second game you can find Harold with a tree growing out of his head that he is affectionately named Bob. We don't know where the tree came from or why it's growing out of his head, but we can certainly assume...
All I know is it was something inside that base.
My personal theory is that the tree is simply a seed that was lucky enough to latch on to Harold, or it was able to feed on some of the FEV that was stored inside Harold's ghoulified body. He doesn't really elaborate on it all either though, so it's completely up in the air. However, in Fallout 3 we find Harold one last time in a growing settlement, quite literally as a massive tree. Bob the tree planted in Harold's head had grown to eventually overtake him, rooting him in place and beginning to spawn an entire forest ecosystem around him. However, this forest isn't like any other in that it's completely clean, healthy plants that are all growing around him from Bob, and even some glowing fungus as well. These plants are not only immune to radiation and are safe to be around, but have a form of photoreception in their leaves that Harold can see through, which is how Harold was even able to contact the Lone Wanderer, as he was able to see him through the leaves. Harold, in that sense, may either be psychic, or it could also be that this single tree has created a massive root system that is able to directly transfer information to Harold himself, which does, once again, have some basis in reality. How is he able to do this? Well, once again...
All I know is it was something inside that base.
But let's get back to these plants and fungi one more time, and how they appear to be one of the most common ways of removing radiation from human bodies, and how Harold seems to be, even without his effort or will, producing massive plant growth and green flowing progress in the wasteland. You might see where I'm going with this, but if Harold's plants continue to ramp up in production and in radiation immunity, that a plant so powerfully radiation immune could one day prop up, capable of actually reversing the harmful effects of radiation. That may even be why mutant ferns in Fallout 4 are natural radiation absorbers, and it would be possible to one day synthesize a cure with this type of radiation immune plant with high levels of scientific progress, all coming from the FEV mutant ghoul hybrid Harold, who in his own unwilling existence is slowly healing the wasteland, and in turn one day even ghouls, potentially becoming something better than their former selves, safe from radiation forever, and still harboring the scars of their previous state, but able to move on and bring forth green growth to the entire wasteland, and that is the ghoul theory. And that's the ghoul theory. More of a half documentation of all the known types of ghouls and how they work, and the types of mutations that can occur among them, but also plenty of analysis of the future of ghouls in Fallout, and what could possibly happen in the future for ghouls. I find it kind of ironic in regards to the Master and his plans in Fallout 1, and his desires to be an advocate for the future of the wasteland in the name of progress and healing, and restoring a safe society. However, Harold actually became a greater beacon of hope, potentially capable of restoring the entire wasteland to a lush green world once more, seemingly almost taking the destiny the Master had sought for himself, and regardless of what happened to him at the end of Fallout 3, whether the player mercy killed him or convinced him to give the tree minders another shot, Harold's forest, and in turn Bob, would likely continue to grow even without him, which is more than the Master ended up doing in the end, and even more so without Harold even desiring to do so initially. Do I think that Harold could be making one final appearance in Fallout? Although it's not likely, as Harold was seen completely rooted to the ground, so unless he became a hive mind connected to all living things in his forest truly, or maybe Harold eventually took control of Bob's network fully and became a sort of tree behemoth, I don't know. And do I think that ghouls could truly be cured? And my response to that is, with everything that we've seen, ghoulism not being totally permanent state seems entirely possible. Perhaps that will be a key point of contention in the next Fallout game, as with Fallout 76, the feature of becoming a ghoul was widely well received. But until then, ghouls will remain the scarred subsect of humanity, being a reminder of the horrors of radiation.